Hi, my name is JJ Stillman, and for my first statistics project, I am covering whether or not Grammy nominations reflect how popular an artist is. In this presentation, I'm going to go over things such as standard deviation, scatter plots, and measures of central tendency to determine whether or not Grammy nominations reflect how popular an artist is. I chose this topic because the Grammys just happened, and I figured it's something that is impactful for what is going on in the world today. And also, I love music. I love talking about music, and I figured that this would be something I would know a lot about. The first step in this project is finding data. And what I did to do this is I looked into the artists with the most Grammy nominations from the pop, rap, country, and rock genres. I chose these genres because they're the most commonly streamed, and I believe they will allow for the most accurate depiction of these stats. After that, after finding out which artists had the most nominations, I went and found their monthly listeners from Spotify. I then went and plotted those on a graph and then used that graph and used other statistics to determine any possible correlation. Listed below is all 50 of the top Grammy nominated artists, along with the number of nominations and the number of monthly listeners. After collecting my data, the first thing I did was make a scatter plot. You can see on the scatter plot that monthly listeners are listed on the x-axis and Grammy nominations are on the y-axis. These range from anywhere from 2 million monthly listeners to 136 million monthly listeners, and 0 Grammy nominations all the way up to around 100. What I found from the scatter plot was that there's a clear trend between the increase in monthly listeners and an increase in Grammy nominations. This was displayed by looking at the bottom section of the graph where you can see that it slowly trends upwards. However, there are a few variations in this graph, including the spike in the middle around the 40 to 80 million monthly listeners, where you can see that they are all significantly higher than the trend line, as well as the little cluster at the beginning of the trend line. After plotting all of those pieces of data onto the scatter plot, I went and looked at the measures of central tendency for each of the data sets. The first thing I looked into was the mean. And for the average monthly listeners, I found that the average was 32.82 million. And for the total number of Grammy nominations, I found that the average was 34.54 nominations. I then went on to the median, where I found that the median number of monthly listeners was 20.95 million, and that the median number of Grammy nominations was 32. After that, I found the mode, and I found that the mode for monthly listeners was 6.8 million, as that appeared twice. No other value had more than one appearance. And for Grammy nominations, it was 38, appearing 5 times. The final thing I found was range, which is the difference between the smallest and largest value. And for the range for the monthly listeners, I found that it was 134.1 million, and the range for Grammy nominations was 86. The final piece of data that I found was the standard deviation of each data set. You can see below the formula for standard deviation and what each of the symbols within that means. What I found from calculating the standard deviation was that the standard deviation for monthly listeners was 36.4 million, and the standard deviation for the number of Grammys was 1.49. This was a staggeringly high difference between the two. After finding all of these statistics, I then wanted to analyze the data. My initial analysis was that there was at least a slight correlation between the number of monthly listeners an artist has and the number of Grammy nominations an artist has. However, I did see that there was a little more to it. After deeper analysis from my scatter plot, I found that there's a bit of variation within the scatter plot. In the middle section of the plot, many of the values are greater than the trend line. Additionally, many of the values are tightly packed together near the bottom of the trend line. After looking into standard deviation and measures of central tendency, I found that almost every measure of central tendency for monthly listeners did not reflect the mean of that data set. Many of the values varied greatly and were significantly larger than the values found for the Grammys data set. This led me to believe that much of the variation found on the scatter plot was the result of the number of monthly listeners as opposed to the number of Grammy nominations. My final conclusion was, after taking all data into account, was that Grammy nominations generally do reflect the popularity of an artist. However, in spite of these findings, any variation from this trend is more due to the consumption of an artist's music or the number of monthly listeners instead of the rewarding of Grammys. Listed below is my works cited. This included Spotify in using the numbers of monthly listeners based on their app, and Wikipedia, in which where I found the Grammy Award winners and the amount of times they were nominated. Thank you for watching my presentation.